If you ask someone with the most basic knowledge of Marxism what it is that Marx believed, the most common answer would probably be that we should all be equal. And it's also common, of course, to see the people that most promote egalitarianism identifying themselves as Marxists or communists. So it may be a surprise to most then to discover that the beliefs held by the modern form of the social justice warrior are quite antithetical to what Marx and Engels, who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto with Marx, actually believed. And so it may be worth looking more deeply at their views specifically on equality and more specifically on racial egalitarianism. But before looking at Marx, it's always worth first surveying the thought of Hegel, who was, of course, hugely influential on Marx. And Hegel's view of history as a progression of universal Geist or spirit advancing into greater degrees of freedom is well known. What's less known is that Hegel considered individual races to have various degrees of historical development, and even considered some races to exist outside of the progress of history. Either they had never played any role in history and never would, as in the case of black Africans, or they were insignificant peoples whose history was irrelevant, or they were frozen at civilizational levels at which the more advanced portions of mankind had already left behind. In a paper titled Racism and Rationality in Hegel's Philosophy of Subjective Spirit by Darrell Moellendorff, he writes, based on his writings, Hegel appears committed to the following. Number 1, natural or biological racial distinctions are necessary and part of the rational scheme of things. Number 2, associated with the biological differences among races are psychological and spiritual differences. And number 3, the character of these psychological or spiritual differences is that whites are free and rational and other races are not. In these paragraphs, Hegel does not recommend that, given this natural state of affairs, the best socio-political order would be a qualified form of liberalism for whites and despotism or paternalism for other races. But one could, without much effort, infer this. A tacit justification of slavery for non-whites can be seen in the combination of two other passages. The first claims that whole continents, Africa and the Orient, have never had this idea, that being the idea of freedom, and are still without it. In the second is the moral judgment. No absolute injustice is done to those who remain servants, for whoever lacks the courage to risk his life in order to obtain freedom deserves to remain a slave. So Hegel was certainly a man of his time in regards to race, but surely Marx, who inverted Hegel's idealistic view of history into dialectical materialism, corrected for Hegel's bigotry, right? Well, in a book, Karl Marx, Racist, Nathaniel Weil shows that Marx privately developed an entire racial hierarchy and racial view of history by the 1860s. He writes that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were neither internationalists nor believers in equal rights for all races and peoples. They opposed the struggles for national independence for those races and peoples that they despised. They believed that the barbaric and ahistoric peoples who comprised the immense majority of mankind had played no significant role in history and were not destined to do so in the foreseeable future. They regarded them as obstacles to the forward sweep of history. They considered them as objects rather than subjects. They were people who ought to be conquered and exploited by the more advanced nations. Some of these inferior stock were people who ought to be eradicated and swept from the surface of the earth. And indeed, there are ample sources from the writings of Marx and Engels to support this. Marx, for example, wrote to Engels on July 30th, 1862, about one of the leaders of socialism in Germany and his rival Ferdinand Lassalle, whom he referred to as that Jewish Lassalle. He wrote, "It is now absolutely clear to me that, as both the shape of his head and his hair texture shows, he descends from the Negroes who joined Moses' flight from Egypt, unless his mother or grandmother on the paternal side hybridized with it. The pushiness of the fellow is also like." Marx even championed slavery in North America. When Pierre-Joseph Proudhon published a book called The Philosophy of Poverty, Marx replied with a vitriolic rebuttal entitled The Poverty of Philosophy. Proudhon had advocated the emancipation of slaves in the US, to which Marx replied, "Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe out North America from the map of the world and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Abolish slavery and you will have wiped America off the map of nations." It seems quite conclusive that Marx's views on race were anything but egalitarian, but what about Friedrich Engels? Well, Marx's colleague Engels was equally racist in his views. When he learned that Marx's son-in-law, who had some African ancestry, was running as a socialist in a district that also contained the Paris Zoo, Engels observed, "Being in his quality as a degree closer to the rest of the animal kingdom than the rest of us, he is undoubtedly the most appropriate representative of that district." Not only did Engels express racial hatred on the individual level, but he also went so far as to advocate the entire extinction of certain races. In fact, in his work, The Magyar Struggle, Engels predicted that everyone bar the Germans, the Poles and the Magyars would necessarily perish for the coming world revolution. He wrote, "There is no country in Europe which does not have in some corner or other one or several ruined fragments of peoples. Among all the large and small nations of Austria, only 3 standard bearers of progress took an active part in history and still retain their vitality: the Germans, the Poles, and the Magyars. Hence they are now revolutionary. All the other large and small nationalities and peoples are destined to perish before long in the revolutionary world storm. For that reason, they are now counter-revolutionary. The next world war will result in the disappearance from the face of the earth, not only of reactionary classes and dynasties, but also of entire reactionary peoples. And that too is a progress." In a work titled Democratic Pan-Slavism, Engels even defended racial bigotry against Slavs as being necessary to continue the revolution in Germany. He wrote, "To the sentimental phrases about brotherhood which are being offered here on behalf of the most counter-revolutionary nations of Europe, we replied that hatred of Russians was, and still is, the primary revolutionary passion among Germans. That since the revolution hatred of Czechs and Croats has been added, and that only by the most determined use of terror against these Slav peoples can we, jointly with the Poles and the Magyars, safeguard the revolution. Then fight a merciless struggle for life and death with the Slavs who betray the revolution, the struggle for the destruction and ruthless terror, not in the interests of Germany, but in the interests of the revolution." And Engels was not alone in his disdain for the Slavic peoples, because Marx himself wrote, "This splendid land, that being the Balkans, has the misfortune to be inhabited by a conglomerate of different races and nationalities, of which it is difficult to say which of them are the most incapable of progress and civilization." And then there is the anti-Semitism of Marx. As his thought developed, he became more and more hostile to world Jewry. In an article titled "The Russian Loan," published in 1856, he writes, "Thus we find every tyrant backed by a Jew, as is every pope by a Jesuit. In truth, the cravings of oppressors would be hopeless, and the practicability of war out of the question, if there were not an army of Jesuits to smother thought and a handful of Jews to ransack pockets. The real work is done by the Jews, and can only be done by them, as they monopolize the machinery of the loan-mongering mysteries by concentrating their energies upon the barter trade and securities. Here and there and everywhere that a little capital courts investment, there is ever one of these little Jews ready to make a little suggestion or place a little bit of a loan. Thus do these loans, which are a curse to the people, a ruin to the holders, and a danger to the governments, become a blessing to the houses of the children of Judah. This Jew organization of loanmongers is as dangerous to the people as the aristocratic organization of landowners. The fortunes amassed by these loanmongers are immense, but the wrongs and sufferings thus entailed on the people and the encouragement thus afforded to their oppressors still remain to be told. The fact that 1855 years ago Christ drove the Jewish money changers out of the temple, and that the money changers of our age enlisted on the side of tyranny happen again chiefly to be Jews, is perhaps no more than a historical coincidence. The loan-mongering Jews of Europe do only on a larger and more obnoxious scale what many others do on one smaller and less significant. But it is only because the Jews are so strong that it is timely and expedient to expose and stigmatize their organization. In his later thought, Marx became much more vitriolic on the Jewish question, and in a paper he wrote titled "On the Jewish Question," Marx came to express a more comprehensive and hostile anti-Semitism. He wrote, "What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist. Money degrades all the gods of man and turns them into commodities. The bill of exchange is the real god of the Jew. His god is only an illusory bill of exchange. The chimerical nationality of the Jew is the nationality of the merchant, of the man of money in general." Marx ominously concludes at the end of this paper, "Once society has succeeded in abolishing the empirical essence of Judaism, huckstering and its preconditions, the Jew will have become impossible, because his consciousness no longer has an object, because the subjective basis of Judaism, practical need, has been humanized, and because the conflict between man's individual sensuous existence and his species existence has been abolished. The social emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of society from Judaism." In other words, Marx ultimately concludes on the Jewish question with the conclusion that in order for society to emancipate itself, it must ultimately emancipate itself from Judaism, which means an end to Judaism and Jewish practices in whatever form. So this may be troubling to modern egalitarians, but perhaps it can be explained away by the fact that Marx and Engels were men of their time. Everyone was a racist bigot back then. They just weren't educated enough to know the obvious truth of racial equality. But the problem is that in a more fundamental philosophical way, Marx and Engels weren't egalitarian. So even if a modern egalitarian says that they had racial bigotry, but because they held egalitarian social views, ultimately you can still take their views and conclude a racial egalitarian worldview from it, then you can overlook this. But the fundamental point of all of this is that the common view of Marx and Engels as being egalitarians is false. It's false in these individual examples, but it's also false more fundamentally because Marx and Engels did not desire an egalitarian social order. In fact, Marx and Engels rejected equality as a social ideal and as a permanent yardstick against which social arrangements could be judged. This can be seen in Marx and Engels' reaction to the programme of the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. In March 1875, Engels complained in a letter that the programme mistakenly advocated the elimination of all social and political inequality rather than the abolition of all class distinctions. For Engels, the goal of total social equality was impossible and represented the ambitions of an underdeveloped form of socialism. He wrote, "As between one country, one province, and even one place and another, living conditions will always evince a certain inequality which may be reduced to a minimum, but never wholly eliminated. The living conditions of alpine dwellers will always be different from those of the plainsmen. The concept of a socialist society as a realm of equality is a one-sided French concept, deriving from the old liberty, equality, fraternity. A concept which was justified in that, in its own time and place, it signified a phase of development, but which, like all the one-sided ideas of earlier socialist schools, ought now to be superseded, since they produce nothing but mental confusion, and more accurate ways of presenting the matter have been discovered." But isn't this counterintuitive? Didn't Marx want to seize the means of production and have a classless society? Isn't communism by definition egalitarian? Well, there is an important distinction here. While Marx saw the end of class distinctions and the socialization of the means of production as a necessary and desirable progression of history, he did not desire this as a means to equality, but rather desired this specific equality as a means to greater facilitate human freedom and development, which was ultimately Marx's goal. In other words, Marx only desired forms of equality on the grounds that they led to greater freedom, rather than desiring equality as a goal and seeing freedom as a hindrance, as we see with many egalitarians.